Hi everyone, or good evening everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, all 76 of you, on this Tuesday evening. My name's Chantel Lewis and I'm really looking forward to chairing this session titled I Need Air, Solitary Confinement and Immigration Detention, organised by Bail for Immigration Detainees, the charity. Just a bit about Bail for Immigration Detainees, or BID, as you'll probably hear us refer to the acronym throughout this session today. BID is an independent charity established in 1999 to challenge immigration detention in the UK. They assist in detained asylum seekers and migrants in removal centres and prisons to secure release from detention through the provision of free legal advice, information and representation. They also provide free legal advice and representation to detainees on deportation. So today, I come to this session as a chair, definitely not as an expert, but as someone that definitely wants to learn more about this, and hopefully as someone that is outside of these areas of that need our urgent attention, I can sort of bring to the session and the chairing some sort of quite what we would see, if you're not an expert, as basic questions to experts about what it is that's been happening for a very long time here in the UK. Just to say what we're going to be running through, what we're going to be doing this evening until about 7:30. We're going to start the session with a short film titled I Need Air. Yes, that's going to be for the first sort of 10 minutes. And then we're going to get into a series of talks from experts, and we do actually have a service user as well who's going to be sharing their experience. So first of all, we have, apologies, let me just get my notes in order. We have Aranya Kulagas, who is a legal manager for Bail for BID. And then we have author and journalist Daniel Trilling. Then we have Richard, a former BID client. And then we have Dr. Rachel Bingham, who is a clinical advisor at Medical Justice. So yeah, bear with us this evening. We've got those speakers, and then we're also going to be doing Q&A. So as the sessions and the film sort of go on this evening, please do put questions in the Q&A box. If you anything, there's no sort of wrong or right question with regards to this stuff. We're all learning here, and this is a really important and radical space for us to find out how we can really, have it make change and have an impact on such urgent matters. So yeah. Thank you for listening to that sort of rambling there of me. Hopefully I'll get a bit clearer as the time goes on. It is Tuesday evening. Anyway, so Elisa, we're going to begin with the short film I Need Air to sort of set the terrain of the conversation for today. Wow, that was such a moving and emotional documentary. Very much lost words. I don't think any words could do justice to the short film. That was really, really incredible. Also, quite heart-wrenching. Thank you so much, BID, for making that available for all of us, and for Omar for sharing his story, and Jessie for producing that. Really, really amazing work. But also, it reminds us why we're here today. Aranya, I'm gonna come to you first. Is that okay? Aranya, I'm just gonna introduce the audience to who you are. Aranya is a barrister and legal manager of the EE project at BID. Over the course of the pandemic, Aranya became increasingly concerned about how many of her clients were being detained under conditions amounting to solitary confinement. After witnessing the devastating impact this was having on their health and well-being, Aranya began collecting testimonies, which were later published in our report, Every Day is Like Torture, Solitary Confinement and Immigration Detention. Aranya, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm going to pass over to you now.
Thank you, Chantel, and thanks everyone for being here. It's an absolute privilege to be sharing a platform with such a brilliant panel, including our client Richard. I'm pleased that we're shedding light on such a devastating issue. As Chantal mentioned, I'm one of the legal managers at BID, and I was responsible for getting people out of immigration detention during the pandemic, primarily by way of preparing immigration bail applications. During the course of our work, we noticed that the dark and punitive practice of immigration detention in the UK just became darker and more punitive still. The Home Office's use of solitary confinement is just a glaring example of that. Today, I'm just going to be speaking about our clients' experiences of solitary confinement, how we responded as an organisation, and what the position is now. Firstly, I think it's helpful to understand what solitary confinement is and has been defined as. So the UN standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, otherwise known as the Mandela rules, define solitary confinement as the confinement of prisoners for 22 hours or more a day without meaningful human contact. Prolonged solitary confinement is where that practice exceeds 15 consecutive days, and indefinite solitary confinement is where this continues without a timescale. Notably, the Mandela rules prohibit prolonged and indefinite solitary confinement entirely. And the reason for that is because such practices are held to constitute torture or other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. A lot of you will know that that definition is analogous to that of Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. We want to make it clear from the outset that alongside immigration detainees, solitary confinement affects serving prisoners and those on remand. It is also by no means a new practice. However, it is the case that it's been deployed more during the pandemic. And whilst our focus is on immigration detainees in prisons, we recognise that the rights of serving prisoners have also been jeopardised during this time. But other organisations such as the Howard League and the Prisoners Advice Service will be better placed to speak about that particular group of people, and we support them in their efforts to do so. In terms of BID clients, our clients are those who are detained in prisons following the end of their criminal sentences. Instead of being released at the end of their criminal sentences in the same way as British nationals would be, the Home Office actively made the decision to detain them in prisons. And I emphasise the word actively. The notion that there was no choice but to hold people in conditions amounting to solitary confinement in prisons to control the spread of COVID-19 is simply misplaced. To say that there was no other choice is to misrepresent the Home Office's powers of immigration detention. In the case of immigration detainees held in prisons, the Home Office always has and has had the power to release them on immigration bail and to monitor them and supervise them in the community if necessary. Stringent and often intrusive bail conditions are available to the Home Office, such as the use of 24-hour GPS monitoring, frequent reporting conditions, curfew requirements, and residence requirements. And therefore, any contention that the absolute misery of solitary confinement was necessary is wrong. And worse still, the idea that it was good for immigration detainees or that it was in their best interests to keep them in that way is perverse. At the very least, the Home Office could have transferred detainees in prisons to a detention centre. Although it's BID's position that immigration detention should be ended entirely, we do recognise that detainees in immigration detention centres have greater freedoms than those in prisons, such as constant access to their phones, the ability to move around more, and more reliable access to legal advice. Instead of releasing people or transferring people to IRCs, detention centres, that is, the Home Office chose to essentially force people to serve extended prison sentences during a pandemic. But this time, it was made worse by the fact that they had no release date to look forward to. We want two things to be known from our experience of working with immigration detainees during the pandemic. Firstly, the Home Office frequently detained people in conditions amounting to prolonged and indefinite solitary confinement, practices which are deemed completely unacceptable by the Mandela rules, and it continues to do so. Secondly, having witnessed the extent of the human misery and suffering caused by solitary confinement, it's clear to us why the Mandela rules explicitly prohibit its prolonged and indefinite use. Our clients were and are often locked in their cells for 22 to 24 hours per day in cramped spaces with little to no natural light. Sometimes they're unable to shower, exercise, or make phone calls. They've described their days and nights as blurring together, with nightmares and reality being just as bad as each other. And those with pre-existing mental health conditions become more ill, and those without them develop them. Where people shared a cell, we categorize them as being in prolonged cell confinement rather than solitary confinement. And the challenges that these clients experienced were both similar and different in certain ways, such as having limited space to exercise in their cells and little privacy. An extreme example of how difficult life could be with a cellmate was where one of our clients was so vulnerable that he would self-harm frequently in order to manage his distress, and he even attempted suicide. His cellmate, who was a source of support, managed to stop him from committing suicide on one occasion, but he was nevertheless, understandably, left extremely traumatized and distressed by what he was continuing to witness. As our work progressed during the pandemic, we heard more and more worrying accounts of hardship. One of our clients, Omar, who participated in the short film, entered prison without any acute mental health conditions, but after several months of solitary confinement reported that his body was starting to shake by itself. His heart wouldn't stop pounding against his chest, and worryingly, he was beginning to lose his memory. He told us that he had stopped writing to his family because it was so distressing for him that he could no longer write like he used to. So it was like his coping, he could no longer cope with his coping mechanism. We collected our clients' testimonies to share with the outside world. These testimonies formed the basis of our joint report with Medical Justice titled "Every Day is Like Torture," and other newspaper articles published in The Observer, The Independent, and the British Medical Journal. In terms of our casework response, we did a number of things. So firstly, we applied for bail and included a section in our grounds for bail on solitary or prolonged cell confinement. We argued that the conditions of detention were relevant to the question of whether or not it was reasonable to maintain it. We also included evidence in our bail bundle on why solitary and prolonged cell confinement was so harmful, by including medical reports generously prepared by doctors at Medical Justice. We also included evidence already in the public domain. There's so much evidence in the public domain about the impact of solitary confinement on human beings. Of note, The Lancet had written that the impact of solitary confinement had been known to be linked to higher mortality rates. So in other words, solitary confinement kills. We noticed that judges were actually receptive to these arguments and were willing to grant bail. However, due to the Home Office's delays with finding accommodation, suitable accommodation that is, and delays from the probation service in checking addresses for suitability, people couldn't be released immediately. And so therefore they were granted bail in principle, which meant that they could only be released once a suitable address was found. So this often entailed several weeks and sometimes even months of languishing in solitary confinement, even after a judge had decided to grant them bail in principle. Where bail in principle was granted and a client was awaiting accommodation, we would request from the Home Office that they be transferred to an immigration detention centre in the meantime. But getting a response from the Home Office on these transfer requests was sometimes like getting blood out of a stone. There was no standard procedure or timescale for a response for a transfer request. So it was just a case of constantly chasing the Home Office and sometimes even asking judges at bail review hearings to compel the Home Office to provide a response through directions. And we noticed that it was usually when public law solicitors became involved and instigated unlawful detention proceedings that the Home Office would act with some degree of respect and expedition and actually do something. This shouldn't have had to be the case. We also wrote as an organisation to the Home Office, alerting them to our clients' experiences and calling for the release of immigration detainees in prisons. It's always been BID's position that immigration detention in prisons needs to be ended as a priority, and the pandemic simply emphasised that. In their response, the Home Office maintained that they were doing everything that they could to support people in prisons, promote a safe environment and promote good welfare practices. Apparently, one of the ways in which they were doing this was by providing in-cell workout packs. It's unclear what these workout packs were, but I highly doubt that they would have even fractionally alleviated the absolute living despair, the reality and despair of solitary confinement. It's also of note that in their response, the Home Office didn't once recognise the term solitary confinement. It wasn't, that term wasn't included in their response to us once. In terms of the position now, despite us taking all of these actions, the current reality is that people continue to be detained in conditions amounting to solitary confinement. We're aware of the Prison Officers Association even welcomes the use of increased lockdowns, as it's easier to manage the prison population, which is concerning to say the least. It's clear that solitary confinement isn't going away. One client recently told us that he was locked in his cell for 40 days and prevented from showering. Another told us that the only way for him to cope was to self-harm, and he said it was to get the pain out, as Omar said in the video. The distress in our clients' voices is palpable. We will continue to work to secure our clients' liberty by applying for bail in the short term. As for the long term, although it's our position that immigration detention should be ended completely, we're calling for the end of immigration detention in prisons at the very least in the interim. We have and will continue to collect evidence to pursue that goal, and we ask that you support us in our campaign to end this extremely harmful practice. Thank you for listening.
Aranya, that was amazing, and that was so clear, so clear, and just really the way you've just presented all that information to us just really demonstrates how important democratizing this information is in terms of understanding the harms that are, both sponsored by and reproduced by the state day in, day out, and it's just really, really important to have this kind of detail. So thank you so much, Rania, particularly for how that was presented. Something that actually really stood out to me that you said, and it's just playing on my mind massively, is about can no longer cope with the coping mechanism, as in the process of writing, and that in itself being a way of coping, not being able to do that. It just shows how awful this is. Thank you so much, Aranya. There is quite a lot of questions coming through, but we're gonna save those until we've had all our presentations. I hope that's okay for those that I know. We've got some quite some really important and actual previous people that have experienced this writing as well to us. So we'll come to you a bit later on in the Q&A. Next, we're going to speak to and hear from Dr. Rachel Bingham, who's the clinical advisor at Medical Justice. So Rachel is the clinical advisor at Medical Justice and has done a medico-legal assessments for people in immigration detention centres since 2010. Rachel works in the NHS as a GP as well. At Medical Justice, her role is to provide training and support for their network of about 65 volunteer doctors, providing independent visits and assessments for people in immigration detention centres and writing medical legal reports. Rachel, you're amazing. Thank you so much for coming this evening and presenting for us. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Well, thank you very much, Chantal, for what a lovely introduction. Thank you. Thanks to BID and Elisa for having me here, and also to Omar, and congratulations on your film there, which I think showed more powerfully than I can express in more medical terms exactly what the mental health impact of such conditions could be. I will echo some of what Aranya has said. I came to this topic likewise because our organisation Medical Justice was hearing from our clients that they were being kept in their cells for over 23 and a half hours a day. as Chantal said, my work has been documenting medical evidence for people's asylum claims. So I'd had training from medical justice and from freedom from torture in documenting the health and mental health consequences of torture. And that, of course, included mental health consequences of solitary confinement. So when I heard that our clients were in these conditions for such long periods and ongoing for so many weeks, of course, my mind immediately went to that link of what we know about the damage that this can cause. And unfortunately, I think that has been borne out in all of the knowledge that we've gained since that time last year. As I was asked to speak from a medical perspective, I thought it might be helpful to begin just by contextualizing what's happened during the pandemic, with a few thoughts about what was already known about the health impact of immigration detention. I just want to put up a couple of quotes. So I'm going to share my screen just briefly. This quote essentially summarizes what was already well recognized and very clear. It's from Mary Bosworth's review of mental health of immigration detainees. This was in 2016. She found that literature from across all the different bodies of work and jurisdictions consistently finds evidence of a negative impact of detention on the mental health of detainees. This was replicated in a systematic review in 2018. This was a huge review of 26 studies, 2,099 participants, and the authors found that all studies examining the association between immigration detention and mental health deterioration found a significant relationship, and the duration of detention was positively associated with severity of mental health symptoms. I think understanding how immigration detention itself can be so harmful is relevant to understanding the background context onto which this indefinite lockdown was imposed. Our examination of these issues shows a number of factors contributing to the risks to health of immigration detainees, which were amplified by the management of the pandemic in prison. So these are background factors going into this situation. Even before the pandemic, separation from social and professional support during detention was already thought to have a negative impact on immigration detainees' mental health. Of course, these isolation measures were introduced to reduce the spread of infection, but really amplified the isolation already experienced by detainees. Even in the community, we know that that isolation has had a negative mental health impact, and that's clearly amplified in the extreme setting we're discussing today. There was already a background of mental health issues. So rates of mental health issues in immigration detainees are very high. We don't know the exact prevalence, but most studies have produced estimate rates of about 50 to 75% of people detained under immigration powers having mental health issues or unmet mental health needs. The most common problems we see are depression and PTSD, but we also see people with psychotic mental health issues such as schizophrenia and with severe anxiety. As a background to that, there's very high rates of trauma in this population, adverse life events, losses, and traumatic experiences. So we quite often see people who've given a history of torture or trafficking. For these people, an added stressor of being detained might be that it contains reminders of past traumatic experiences, details such as locked doors or uniformed guards, or less specific but equally powerful reminders of loss of liberty and the experience of powerlessness. And that can really provoke an increase in symptoms there. Other vulnerabilities, we see people with a range of physical health issues, physical disability, learning difficulties, issues with mental capacity, past experiences of homelessness and addiction, which all increase the mental health risks of immigration detention. Now, of course, even without any of these pre-existing vulnerabilities, a person's mental health could be seriously at risk in a period of prolonged solitary confinement. But I'm raising these issues to set the scene against which this occurred. to show just how dangerous this step was. The report by BID and Medical Justice describes against this background, and as we've seen so powerfully highlighted in the film, and as Aranya has described, how prolonged confinement was experienced by people held in prison solely due to their immigration status. The individuals we described reported a range of symptoms. I will list the most common: increasing depression, anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, insomnia, worsening symptoms of PTSD, I mentioned, self-harm, physical symptoms. So this may be partly because of stress-related reduction in ability to recover and amplification of pain, but also we heard about the difficulty in doing physical activity and of staying in cramped conditions. So we saw increased physical pain, especially back, neck pain, headaches, basically exactly what you would imagine would happen if people were forced to spend prolonged periods in their room or in bed, even if they were physically relatively well to start with. Not surprisingly, against these shattering conditions, we saw increased rates of suicidal thoughts and self-harm. And I think that all of these experiences and reports correspond to what was previously known about the health impact of solitary confinement, which had been reported in the literature already. I think there's much more that I could say on this topic, but I appreciate the experience of the other panelists, so I will stop there, but I would be very happy to take more questions or elaborate on any of that in the discussion. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you so much. Another absolute masterclass in making really difficult topics and quite complex topics clear, understandable, but also not shying away from the issues at hand, and those being urgent, extreme, and actually quite, painful to read. But I think that there will be a lot of people on this call, in this event, that didn't realise or understand the extent to which some of the things are that you have found and have been working on, similar to what Aranya was presenting on as well. There are so many of us that didn't understand the extent of this solitary confinement happening right here in the UK. So I'm probably sound like a broken record, but it is something that I'm sure many people in this call, and I know all you as panelists are passionate about, is this knowledge is power, and the democratization of this information is essential for all of us. Okay, next, Aranya, you're coming back onto the panel, and Rachel, we do have some questions for you that we'll bring to the Q&A shortly. Aranya's going to be interviewing Richard now, who is a former BID client. So Richard entered the UK as a young child. At the end of his sentence, he remained in prison under immigration powers, despite having a right of appeal that meant he could not be removed, and the fact that flights to his country of origin had been suspended for a long time due to the pandemic. He was detained under immigration powers and was confined to his cell 22 hours per day for over a year. So Richard is not going to be using his camera, and he's using a pseudonym, obviously to protect his identity and experiences. But Richard, thank you so much for coming to this event today. And Aranya, I'm going to pass over to you now.
Thank you, Chantal. Richard, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your experiences. I just wanted to ask you firstly, if you could just explain briefly how you came to be in solitary confinement. Richard, can you hear us?
Well, I was already in prison serving my sentence. I was for a national prison, which is a prison that's migrant. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I think you're breaking up slightly, but we can hear you.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was already serving a sentence in a foreign national prison, and coming to the end of my sentence, the Home Office informed me. The Home Office informed me that they intended to deport me back to my country. Just before I finished my sentence, a few days before, I was then informed that they were detaining me until they could deport me. Even though I had an appeal pending to fight to stay, they told me that I was going to stay in prison until a decision was made and they were not granting me bail. Then I contacted BID, who helped me get bail from jail, but the Home Office still had a few more months after, but only after the judge 5 days that they magically found an address for me in 3 days after so long waiting.
So you got bail in principle first, and then there was delay in the Home Office releasing you because of address problems. And then when the judge finally gave them an ultimatum of 5 days, that's when they released you.
Yeah, they dragged it out as long as they possibly could. It was like having another sentence with no release date.
Yeah. And having grown up in the UK, how did it feel to be detained and then put through the deportation process?
Well, it makes me feel unwanted. It makes me feel lost. It makes me feel like I have no home in the world. This has been my home since I was a little kid. I came here very young with my family, and I've always thought of this as home. Mm-hmm. I've been back to my country a few times since I came to live here, but that never felt like home. Home to me was in the UK. And to know that they're trying so hard to make me not want to be here or to kick me out it just feels like I don't belong anywhere.
Yeah. And could you describe what the conditions were like in your cell and what a day was like in solitary confinement?
Well, my cell was very small. My bed was about a bit less than a meter away from the toilet. So as you can imagine, it didn't smell great, especially because you can't open the windows. You can only open the flap and there's like a grill on it. Can't even stick a finger out. And it was just very small, no room to do any exercise. Most of the days I would just stare at the walls and basically live in my mind, because after so long of being in a cell, I almost lost some of my ability to socialize with people. Officers would speak to me, I wouldn't want to speak to them. I would overanalyze everything. TV would be on sometimes. I wouldn't even be able to concentrate on anything I was watching. Wouldn't be able to concentrate on a book I wanted to read. And it was like my mind was torturing itself because I was constantly overthinking. I had no motivation to do any kind of physical activity because I was so exhausted just from all the things that were going around in my head. I found it very hard to sleep. When I did sleep, I had nightmares, but then people are usually fortunate enough to wake up from a nightmare and realize that it's not real. But for me, it was real. I was still living that nightmare.
That's really powerful. And how understanding was staff about your difficulties, if at all?
Staff, they're there to tick boxes on their paperwork, open locks, lock doors, ask you if you want feeding. They're there just to basically keep you alive. They don't really care about much other than ticking enough boxes to keep their job.
And could you talk a bit about any of your mental health diagnosis before you went to prison, and how your mental and physical health was impacted by solitary confinement?
Oh, I already suffered from depression from a young age and anxiety. I had a stress disorder because of past traumas in my early years. And being in solitary, you have nothing to distract you, nothing to engage. And all I had was my mind of different situations I'd been in the past. Everything just basically got like enhanced. It was like all of my symptoms got stronger, like they're on steroids. Everything just became a lot harder, and not being able to concentrate, not being able to socialize. I hated seeing other people. I just got to the point I didn't want to see daylight. I just wanted to, not that I wanted to, I just felt like I couldn't deal with people.
Yeah.
And
you were trapped in your own mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've been released for quite some time now. What was it like being released, and has your experience of solitary confinement continued to impact you?
Well, yeah, I still get nightmares about my detention, my time in prison. Even my partner tells me sometimes that I scream in my sleep. And it's still a very scary thought, because I know the way the Home Office does things. They do things deliberately to make it harder for me, so they can then have a minimal justification to try and lock me up again. And I'm trying my best not to give them that justification, but I don't know. I'm just scared that someday, somewhere, someone in the Home Office will push a button on a computer and then someone comes and kidnaps me. Being released from prison, it was a complete shock to the system. I was sitting in my cell, and I knew that the judge had given an order for me to be released, no matter what the Home Office wanted to try. Even if they hadn't approved the addresses I had given them, that I was to be released. And I was still waiting. No one told me anything. And one day, immigration worker just came to my cell and told me, "You're being released." Even then, I didn't believe it, because I just got to the point where I couldn't believe any good news. Anything good didn't sound real to me. Then I waited another 5 hours until they actually opened the door. I called my family to pick me up. But being released out the gate, they had given me some paperwork of where I was to live and my conditions. It took my mum a little while to find the address where I was supposed to stay at. And when I got there, I was told that I had a curfew, so that I could not go back out again that day. And because of the COVID rules, that my mum wouldn't be able to come in and spend some time with me. So I just had to tell her bye, and that I would try to see her whenever they let me come out. And it just felt like I was released from one prison to another prison. Just like
horrible.
And yeah, the very strict conditions carried on for a few months. I was happy to just see my family, but I always had the impression that they're just trying to make things hard for me, just so I want to give up.
Well, it's testament to your strength that you've continued with the process, I think. Is there anything that you'd like to say to the Home Office or to the general public about what you've been through? Is there anything that you'd like them to know?
To the Home Office, I just want to say that everyone they've got in detention is a human, and that what they're doing is they're actually treating immigrants worse than criminals, because at least a criminal, when he gets sentenced, he knows his release date. Even murderers know their release date, but not immigrants. And to the people, I just want to say that they should inform themselves about these things, that if they were to read up, find out more, that they would be shocked at some of the stories that are out there from people. And I understand that bad stories like this, not everyone wants to know because it's upsetting, but you have to read up and stop it, because at the end of the day, people are the voters, people are the taxpayers. So the Home Office they're violating people's rights, and then doing this with your vote and with your tax money. So therefore, they're doing it on your behalf. And if you knew what they're doing on your behalf, you wouldn't like it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Richard, for sharing your experience and educating us all on everything that's going on. We really, really appreciate your time. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rania.
Just to echo that, Richard, Aranya, thank you for hosting that interview with Richard. But Richard, yeah, just to say on behalf of myself and the general public within the audience, thank you so much for sharing your experience. And I'm so sorry about everything you've been through. It's not good enough. I think one of the most profound things you just said in terms of advice is inform yourself. You're right, like the Home Office, we're taxpayers, we're all part of this society. And what you said as well about immigrants not knowing when they're going to be let out, like that, the emphasis on time throughout your story is so profound and so important. And thank you so much. I think you're still there, but anyway. Okay. We're going to move on to our final speaker now, who is author and journalist Daniel Trilling, who I am actually quite a big fan of. Daniel's I'm quite a big fan of your writing. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Daniel is a London-based journalist. He writes about migration, nationalism and human rights for The Guardian, the LRB and others. He's author of The Lights in the Distance, Exile and Refuge at the Borders of Europe, and Bloody Nasty People, The Rise of Britain's Far Right. Every time I read the title of your book, I always have to say it in that voice, Bloody Nasty People, because they are. Anyway, Daniel, thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to you now.
All right, thanks very much for that introduction, Chantal. And thank you to Richard and Arania and Rachel for the presentation so far and sharing your knowledge and experience with us. So as a journalist, a lot of the work I've done has been reporting in the UK and also in other bits of Europe to look at the ways in which that states try to police migration affects the individuals who end up right at the center of it. And I also try and look at the kind of institutions that are set up to do that and how they have kind of grown up and why they've come to function in the way that they do. And I'm not an expert on these things. I go and I try and observe, and I listen, I speak to people, I listen to them, and I try and piece together some of the kind of bigger background picture. And I just want to have a quick go at doing that today, because I think we've heard a lot of extremely useful and as Chantal was saying, really clearly presented information about the specific harm to individuals that immigration detention in the UK and within that specifically the growing use of solitary confinement is causing. But what I'd like to do to add to that is just to talk briefly about why I think we should also see detention as a political problem for all of us, not just a problem for the safety and well-being of people who end up inside detention, but something that's actually affects all of us collectively. And hopefully by doing that can also just prompt us to think about, well, what could we then do collectively to change things as well. So I think in Irania's presentation, she was already talking about the fact that many of the harms that we see in immigration detention also are there in the regular prison system. But I think there's a really important reason for thinking about immigration detention slightly separately. And it's this: I think perhaps we've become used to it being there as a kind of fact of life almost. But actually to see immigration detention used at this scale in a country like the UK is quite a recent thing. It's something that's grown up within living memory and is being used at an unprecedented scale right now. And that's the UK is not alone in this respect. You see this in forms of immigration detention that resemble that being used in the UK, being used by most, if not all, developed states that want to exert control over people coming in and out of their territories. And I think it's a really striking example of how modern nation states, even liberal democracies such as the UK, have a tendency, when they're faced with populations that they consider inconvenient, to set up these kind of grey zones where people are segregated, they're separated off from the rest of society. And that's a kind of physical separation, as you see very clearly with something like immigration detention. But it's also a separating out of people in terms of their rights as well. So you have these spaces that very quickly, they might be set up for a specific reason, or the justification for them being there is one thing, but you see very quickly how the kind of arbitrary powers that are used over people within those spaces just grow and grow, and they end up being used for purposes that were at least not stated as the intent at first. And that's also where people, and sort of crucial to that is the way in which people are deprived of rights when they're put into situations like detention. And I think it's particularly concerning at the moment that these kind of spaces are proliferating in the world at the moment. In Europe, to take an example, in the last 6 or 7 years since the refugee crisis of 2015 to 2016, you've seen a huge growth in the use of immigration detention, the growth in the use of camps of various sorts that people are put into for prolonged periods where they don't have their full rights and where they are separated out from the rest of society and so on. And I think that has got really uncomfortable echoes of the way these kind of techniques of separating people out and denying them their rights were used to commit some of the worst colonial and fascist and Stalinist abuses in the 19th and 20th centuries. So obviously, the situation we have in the UK right now is not as extreme as some of those examples from the past, but I think there's a kind of underlying dynamic that that it echoes and is really worrying. And I think immigration detention in the UK particularly is an example of where, when a government starts opening up these kind of spaces, they almost take on a life of their own. So they keep growing, and it can seem as if, well, no, how have we ended up with this huge, complex and really harmful system? Nobody ever kind of said, this is what we intend to build, yet we've ended up with something that exists in that way and operates in that way. To go over the kind of brief history of detention in the UK, until the late 1990s, the immigration detention was a relatively small process in Britain. I think in 1993, Britain had the capacity to detain about 250 people at any one time for immigration purposes. By 2010, the UK was detaining people, detaining around 25,000 people a year in immigration detention. So that's something that's grown up in very recent memory. But it's also an example of where when you build those kind of spaces like detention centres, they end up kind of pulling more and more people into them. So the new Labour government of Tony Blair, which built many of the detention centres we now have, justified it at the start as being this kind of clean, clinical and quick process for processing people with asylum claims. The idea was that we were going to have these detention centres where people were processed very quickly along a scheme that they called fast track immigration detention, and this would be a very good and quick way of sifting out so-called genuine asylum seekers from bogus claimants. I mean, almost immediately what happened was that people were being detained for very long periods, not the sort of 3 to 5 days that they, I think, initially claimed people would be detained in under the fast track system. As I think Richard made this point very powerfully, that this kind of open-ended detention is in some ways more powerful, sort of more harmful than regular prison sentences, because people stuck in it don't know when it's going to end. But also what then happened over the years from the early 2000s onwards was that you saw the increased use of immigration detention for other purposes as well. And I think there's certainly a dynamic there that once these centres are open, it becomes very easy for officials in the Home Office and the wider system to kind of find reasons to put people into detention or to detain people for reasons of convenience rather than the stated justifications for the system. And I think increasingly from the late 2000s onwards, when there was an increasingly loud kind of tabloid media panic around so-called foreign criminals, so people from, with overseas citizenship who served prison sentences in the UK, there was this pressure to deport more of those people, and the knock-on pressure from that was that people were increasingly sucked into the immigration detention system. And I think the other big change that you've seen over the last 10 to 20 years is that I think sort of officially detention is supposed to be used for purely practical reasons. So immigration detention is supposed to be there because the state has got a reasonable prospect of removing somebody from the country. So people should, in theory, only be detained shortly before they're deported. What actually happens in the system is that people are detained, as we've heard, for long periods, often when the Home Office actually hasn't worked out if it's got the right to remove somebody from the country or not. And I think certainly in the reporting that I've done on this, a pattern that you see again and again from speaking to people who've been through immigration detention is that they feel that it's an extra system of punishment in itself. So people that the Home Office wants to kind of persuade to leave the country will find themselves being put into immigration detention, bailed, taken into detention again at short notice and so on, as a way of kind of coercing people into doing what the government wants. And that's kind of as concise as I could make an overview of the sort of 20-year history of this. But I think hopefully from that account, you see how this system is built up bit by bit, sometimes with unintended consequences, sometimes with intended consequences. But what you have now is that these quite powerful tools for coercion, for punishment, for oppression are in the hands of a hard right government that has made its explicit aim to start chipping away at some of the bigger kind of protections we have from the law, chipping away at human rights protections and so on. And, as we've seen in the last couple of years, it's explicitly made the use of detention a part of that push rightwards. So the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is currently making its way through Parliament, for instance, part of its drive to create, or rather to deter asylum seekers from coming to the UK without permission, is to create detention-like conditions, like the barracks that we saw being used during the pandemic and that are still being used. And I think the other kind of effect of this system is that, which we haven't really talked about, and I don't have a lot of time to go into here, but I think it's just worth bringing up for the discussion, is that a system like immigration detention is primarily extremely harmful for the people who are at the sharp end of it, but it also dehumanizes the people that administer the system. So I was just thinking about this before the discussion today about the inquiry into abuses at the Brook House Detention Centre, and those accounts that have already come out in the inquiry of the security guards employed to work there taunting naked detainees, insulting people, all as part of this ongoing banter. And I was also thinking about Jimmy Mubenga, who was killed as the British state tried to deport him to Angola in 2010, and thinking about during the inquest into his death, the accounts of racist jokes that were being shared between the guards that were nominally responsible for his safety and for his well-being and so on. And I think, just to conclude, and to kind of reiterate this idea that this is a problem for all of us, and it's a political problem, because it is something that it not only undermines people's rights, but it undermines our ideas of a shared society where we have equality with one another. I think, as Richard explained really strikingly in his presentation, that whole experience of being in detention and not knowing when you wanted to get out, it kind of takes your humanity away from you. And if we have a society that is doing that to people, then we all lose out for it. And I think, we all lose out from it. And I think the way to respond is to try and find ways to break down the divisions that these kind of systems place between us. So I think there's really important work being done by BID and Medical Justice and other organisations to kind of shine a light on abuses and mistreatment and the wider conditions, and to bring those to public light. I think the work being done to challenge things legally is equally important, because that is what can make the material difference between somebody being locked up and somebody being free. But I also think, just as important as all of that, is the need to amplify the voices of people who've experienced the system from the inside, because I think the system only works if it keeps us separated from one another, in the way that it tries to silence people who get caught up in the system. And for those of us who've got the ability on the outside to try and do something about that, I think it's really important we challenge that and try and bring those voices to wider public attention. Thanks.
Daniel, thank you so much for that. As always, clear, concise, and just bring in all the receipts, like both historical and contemporary. Like, that's what I think is just so amazing about your journalism, and what I also want to call scholarship and research, is that you are so great at locating the contemporary urgencies and political issues, but also these huge harms within the wider context of other histories, and how this relates to Britain and its colonial and in a colonial context. So I think that's just so important. And thank you so much as well for bringing up the Nationalities and Borders Bill. Something that I think we're going to lead on the panel on, it's come up quite a lot in the Q&A, is people saying, what can the general public do? I would say, just as chair, one thing that you can do as soon as you get off this call now, this event now, is look up, if you don't know, what the Nationalities and Borders Bill is, and what it plans to do, and what it plans to implement. Really, really essential stuff to educate yourself on, but also that we need to be resisting. So we're now going to have a panel discussion. So if I could ask, everyone to come back. Aranya and Rachel, that's amazing, thank you. So I'm going to begin by asking a question that's come up in the panel that I also had in my pre-questions as well. It's come up quite a lot. What can people do to support BID's campaigning to stop being treated in this way? Like, how can the public help? We've said one thing for starters, is that educate yourself. Knowledge is power. We cannot underestimate that. But what else can people do?
I think it's important to support organisations like BID and other organisations who are providing support services to detainees with their work, and you can do that in a variety of ways. You can get on board with some of our campaigns. For example, we have a campaign to write to your MP about the issue, and we've got a template letter that you can send out that we'll tweet it just after the event. So once you leave the event, you can just send that off, right to your MP immediately. You can also volunteer with us. We're always grateful and delighted to have new people volunteering with us and supporting our clients. So you can do that, and you can look on our website to see how you can volunteer. You can donate if you're able to, of course. But as you said, Chantal, I think the most important thing is to continue to stay informed and educated, so that you can continue to hold those in power and those who have decision-making capabilities to account. This group of people, the Home Office wants this group of people to be ignored and sidelined, and you shouldn't let that happen. Richard said it in the most eloquent way, which is that all of this is being done in your name. It's your money, it's your vote that decision makers are using to implement these harmful practices. So therefore, it's important for you to take back your power and ensure that this doesn't continue to happen.
Aranya, that was brilliant, and also I think that draws on something that Daniel just said as well, in terms of the state and the government, or those in power, those who are doing this, are utilising their capacity and ability to silence people. And we have to resist that in all ways. Those of us that have platforms, those that are able to democratize information, need to do that more than ever. And when you do educate yourself on these matters, tell people don't realize what is happening. That is very, very clear. Rachel, is there anything you want to say about this, particularly with medical justice?
Chantal, I mean, such a lovely question, and I really feel motivated that we definitely want to take action on this issue. Like BID, medical justice is reliant on a network of fantastic volunteers. So, tell your friends, clinicians, doctors, psychologists. We always need more people to go and do assessments for people that find themselves in these conditions, and to write reports and to gather clinical evidence. Thank you. And all that is on our website, Medical Justice. So we'd be really
Rachel,
happy to discuss that
just to
further.
be clear, just to be clear for those that are in the audience. So if someone was going to volunteer for medical justice, ideally we're talking about doctors, clinicians, counsellors, social work. Like what criteria would they need to?
So thank you. So clinicians, medics, psychologists. We'd love to hear from qualified therapists, and we also do have some volunteer interpreters.
That's incredible. That's a lot. I'm sure there are people within this call that satisfy many of those. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Rachel. So I'm gonna just make sure. Right, so we've got the link to we've got the template link for the MP for your MP that we're going to circulate afterwards. But just sort of next question that again does relate to ones that we're having within questions that we're having within the Q&A as well. Someone said, is there an independent body that oversees the current UK government practices? What are they doing about all of this? If no one is overseeing the government practices, what can be done by BID and other organisations to put these issues in the political agenda and public scrutiny? Again, it kind of follows on from the first question, but I'm interested to hear your guys' thoughts on who would we consider to be the independent body when it is the state that's doing this? Is it those that are on the periphery, charities, organisations, movements that are doing it, or is there something else that we can look at? I don't know if Aranya or Daniel want to come in on this.
Well, in terms of challenging, you'd need to challenge the state. So the most effective way would be through the courts. So a legal challenge would be the best way. There are obviously other state bodies such as the Prison Officers Association and independent monitoring boards and so on. But there needs to be, I think, a collated effort to challenge this, because there can be a lot of passing the buck and evading accountability, and it's all too easy for certain bodies to just rely on COVID-19 to justify these practices. So yeah, I think a legal challenge and continued legal challenges are the best ways forward. Having said that, public opinion is also massively important. Yeah, I think the more information is known about what's been done in the British public's name, the more that there should be outrage by it. I think after hearing Omar and Richard's accounts, it will be difficult to see how you couldn't be outraged by it. And I think that this information needs to just be shared more widely. So yeah.
Arinya, thank you so much for that. And I think you're absolutely right. And I don't know, drawing on some of the sort of histories that Daniel was pointing to, in particular thinking about New Labour and them actually building the detention centres initially, like it's been going on for a long time now. So we do need to do something differently. And I think that there are people that would have heard Daniel's presentation then about how long this has been going on for and won't have realised that. So this in itself is a radical space and shows a possibility in terms of learning. But yeah, we've got to keep going with this. Another question in the Q&A, is the growth in the use of prisons due to the profit corporations like US prisons, or are these detention facilities government run? That's quite a good question, because it's sort of thinking like very much the very basics of what we mean when we talk about prisons and what we mean when we talk about detention centres, like the differences and what is driving these, what is funding these. Can anyone come in on that? Daniel, yeah, thank you.
Colleagues on the call might correct me if I get my facts slightly wrong on the specifics of the detention system, but as I understand it, it's both basically. So some detentions are run directly by the state, and some detention centres are run directly by the state, and some are run by outsourced private providers. Yeah, I mean, I think my take on that wider question of that sort of relationship of this, the sort of profit-making corporations in the system is, I think sometimes people can, I think introducing the profit motive definitely creates a dynamic that is harmful for specific reasons, because you've got the way those huge global outsource companies work is that so something like G4S or Serco, these are the kinds of companies that are tasked with running detention centres. You know, their model is that they've got these really small profit margins, so they work at these huge global scales, and it's all about driving down costs and keeping costs low and kind of squeezing the most out of government contracts where they can. That's a dynamic that can create all sorts of harms in its own right, I think. But sometimes people I think it's really important to not let that obscure the fact that the system is designed and by the state for political reasons, and the basic harm is something that is there whether it's being run directly by the state or a private provider. You know, I think it's detention that is the problem, and then a question of who runs it and what conditions do they then run it under is a secondary problem. But to me, it's important to get it that way around.
Daniel, thank you. That was really, really clear, really important there to make that distinction, but also emphasising the overlap as well. Thank you so much for that. Rachel, I have got a question for you, and it's in relation to the sort of assessments that medical justice do and the pandemic. So we've spoken about this solitary confinement being in response to the pandemic. But to what extent was this happening before the pandemic? And what do you believe are the alternatives to stop the spread of COVID in prisons? So what was, in terms of the sort of assessments that you were doing, like, can you talk a little bit about what was happening before the pandemic and what's happening now?
Before the pandemic, in terms of which aspect, Chantal?
Of the assessments that you were doing in the detention centres.
Thank you. Okay, well, please come back to me if I haven't quite answered what you're hoping for. But basically, before the pandemic, we would send volunteer clinicians into detention centres to visit people held in immigration detention, and our clinicians normally do a very detailed health assessment and write a report for that person. Like many health services during the pandemic, we went online, so we did lots of this remotely by video assessment, and that's how we picked up many of these clients that we've been discussing. I think the second part of the question was reducing the spread of COVID, and I think those kind of measures are the sorts of things that have been implemented, but we also need to keep in mind that these measures designed to protect health can also have a health cost. So even as a clinician, when we do our assessment remotely, we realize that isn't quite having the human touch of a face-to-face contact, or you may not be able to do a physical examination, which might add some important findings. So it is always this very difficult cost-benefit analysis. And I think the medically relevant aspect of that is, of course, this is increasing the harm that people are experiencing held in immigration detention and held in prison under immigration powers. And unlike a prison sentence, we know that this is an optional form of detention done for administrative reasons. People are not serving a prison sentence, and that means that it's the benefit of keeping them in detention, according to the Home Office, is weighed against the risks of keeping them in detention. And so here we have a situation where definitely the risks to the person's health of keeping them in detention have gone up because of the pandemic, which means they're exposed to COVID, but also to all of the other risks of increased isolation. So here, I think more than ever before, we're seeing harm to people's health that we believe should be given more weight against the need to keep them in detention perceived by the Home Office.
That's great, Rachel. That's exactly what we wanted to hear in terms of the detail. Just quickly though, sort of in your experience and during the pandemic doing this, Rachel, have you managed to reach more people because you've been remote? Is there been any kind of like in terms of thinking about where we can draw some hope or positivity, reaching more people in terms of getting the assessments done, or is it not as binary as that?
So to some extent, we can reach more people. We feel that some of our busy volunteer doctors can fit in an assessment when perhaps a 2 or 3, 4 hour round trip to a detention centre, you know, they're far away, they're near the airports or far from people's homes. It's perhaps they can fit in an extra assessment. I think that has to be balanced against the fact of a virtual assessment being perhaps less detailed than the in-person one, and we're constantly having to produce more detailed and better quality evidence, as I mentioned, to weigh against these forces of keeping people in detention and to explain really clearly the consequences to people's health. So we really need to produce as strong information as we can, and that can sometimes be hampered by being online, although like all other organisations, we've tried to keep that going, and our volunteers have been fantastic in keeping that going throughout.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. That's really, really clear. Thank you. We've got time for 2 more questions. So I'm going to kind of merge a couple of questions into one. So someone in the Q&A has said, how do authorities justify solitary confinement? Sorry if this is a silly question. It is not a silly question. That is a very reasonable question, an important question that we need to draw on. And on top of that, how is this whole thing not unlawful? What challenges can be made? How are the government able are they able to keep this going because people don't know? So yeah, how do they justify it, and how does this have so much longevity? Quite big questions, but would just be great to get your thoughts on this. Aranya, yeah.
So in terms of how the government justifies solitary confinement, it's a narrative that it's for people's own good, and that they're trying to keep people safe from COVID-19. But that argument fails for several reasons. So as I mentioned earlier, the Home Office have the power to release people. So no, they don't have to keep people in solitary confinement. They can release people, and if they wanted to, impose very strict immigration bail conditions if they really wanted to. You heard from Richard earlier, who said that leaving solitary confinement was like going from one prison to the next because of how stringent those conditions were. The second reason why the Home Office's argument just doesn't work is because there is a lot of research and medical evidence to show that prisons are actually deemed as epidemiological pumps. So it's the higher the prison population, the more likely infectious diseases such as COVID-19 are likely to spread. So by the Home Office keeping people, insisting on detaining more people within the prison estate, it just increases the risk of COVID-19 transmitting throughout the prison population. So the way that the Home Office justify it is one thing, but it doesn't work is the answer.
Thank you so much. That's really clear. Daniel, do you want to say anything on this, or Rachel? Otherwise we're going to have to wrap up, actually. We're running out of time.
I just wanted to say something very quickly that occurred to me, going back to that question of how does the Home Office justify the use, or the government justify the use of solitary confinement. It just reminded me of something that I think, sorry, I can't quite remember if it is in Aranya or Rachel's presentation, but the fact that I think it was Aranya said the Home Office, in all the communication with them, they didn't actually acknowledge they were using solitary confinement. And that struck me, as someone who's reported on the Home Office quite a lot, as a really typical thing, and is part of the way they kind of engineer consent for what they're doing, is that they refuse to acknowledge they're doing it in the first place, or they come up with language that pretends it's not the thing that it is. You know, if you look at the language around deporting people, which, you know, in an everyday understanding, if a state forcibly takes someone and sends them out of the country to another territory, they're deporting them. If you look at the language, you know, Home Office officials will get extremely fussy about that if you use it in the wrong context, and they'll say, oh no, this is a removal, this is whatever, you know, the way these systems, you know, when they're doing something that's so kind of blatantly harmful, and a denial of people's rights, and a denial of kind of even like a kind of the common sense understanding of things like, if you commit a crime, you go to prison for a defined sentence and you're told when you're being released. When they start doing things that divert from some of those basic norms, obfuscating with language is a huge part of it, and that's why sort of challenging it for what it is really important.
There's such important points. I can just see us all on the panel just like nodding along. Like there's such important points, and just really emphasize how the state's able to manipulate. Manipulate through language, but also manipulate through silence, and using things like mechanisms to confuse people, when actually what we can do as people with platforms, people that are able to share this information, is actually be really clear about what is happening. And that's what I feel like you guys have done an amazing job on the panel doing this evening. Thank you so much. And we are going to wrap up there. So huge thank you to Daniel, Aranya, Rachel, and Richard. A massive thank you to Richard as well. I'm just going to end by just reminding everyone who BID are, and what we and how to get in touch. So let me read from my notes. So Bail for Immigration Detention, BID, is an independent charity established in 1999 to challenge immigration detention in the UK. They assist detained asylum seekers and migrants in removal centres and prisons to secure release from detention through the provision of free legal advice, information and representation. They also provide free legal advice and representation to detainees on deportation. And just a reminder of what we've been talking about today in terms of solitary confinement. So since March 2020, almost all prisoners have been placed in lockdown and locked in a small prison cell for almost the entire day. That includes people serving custodial sentences, those held on remand awaiting trial, and immigration detainees. Many of BID's clients detained under immigration powers in prisons reported being held in their cells, either in isolation or with one cellmate, for between 22 to 24 hours per day since the beginning of the pandemic, with people sometimes being held in their cells for days at a time. Thank you again so much to panelists, and thank you so much everyone for joining us this evening. If you want to get, we've spoke a little bit about what you can do within as the sort of general public. Get in touch with BID, get in touch with Medical Justice, educate yourself on the Nationalities and Borders Bill, keep up to date with what's happening, tell a friend, tell people around you about this, and volunteer if you can. If you can't physically volunteer, there's always things that organisations and charities need help with administratively. I hope that's right. I'm right in saying that to you all on this panel. There's always things that you can do, even if you can't physically be somewhere. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, and hopefully we'll see you soon.